Hey guys, how's it going? Today we're going to do a sort of mini tutorial or lesson here on using Vue 3's composition API, and we're going to do a small demonstration here on converting a mixin component into a Vue 3 composable component using Vue 3's composition API. So if you guys haven't heard of Vue 3's composition API, is one of the new features coming up in Vue 3. And although Vue 3 hasn't come out yet, it's good to actually explore some of Vue 3's new features. So there's a composition API plugin available on GitHub for Vue 2. So you can just find it here and you can install it from yarn or npm. All the instructions are here. There's a lot of benefits to using the composition API and Vue 3. So like, for example, the better TypeScript support is one of the examples listed here. And you can even look at some Vue 3 mastery videos if you want to get a better idea on what the composition API actually offers here. But I'm just going to go through over in this little demonstration to do one of the features I think a lot of developers will want to actually do with the composition API, which is to convert one of the mixins. And I know for me and a lot of developers, mixins can be a curse and a blessing. Of course, we use mixins because we want to share some functionality between different components, and there is a lot of benefits in that. We use a lot of code. So of course, in the golden rule of programming is don't repeat yourself, right? DRY. So mixins is a way to reuse some parts of our code that is shared between different components in Vue 2. But the problem with mixins is that if you have too many mixins going on, if you have components that are using multiple mixins, you can have a lot of confusion. It's very hard to read, very hard to maintain, because you have so many different parts of the code that are using a whole bunch of different mixins, right? So you might have like one component using like, 3 or 4 different mixins, and you have different functions coming over from all these mixins. Really, it gets really complicated, it gets really complex and hard to maintain, right? So that's a problem with mixins. So I want to show you guys how to use Vue 3's composition API just in a small example to convert one of these mixins into a composable component, which will actually make it easier to read, easier to maintain, and more modular as well. So right now I'm using a mixin that's based on this library called XState. Now you guys don't have to learn about XState. This is just for my example here. But basically XState is a library for, as it says here, creating, interpreting, executing finite state machines. So you can think of finite state machines as you have different states for your component. So you might have an initial state, and then you might have an awake state. You might have a sleep state. You might have an error state, right? And you have different functions that will transition to these different states depending on certain actions. For example, say you have a component, that just has an initial state that loads, right? And if I press a button, then it might transition into a success state, right? And you might want to show something else or render something else on that state, right? So this is just a brief explanation of XState. You guys don't have to know this library. Just for this example, it's not even like part of the composition API thing. It's just a mixin that we're using. And in my example right here, right? So in my example, I have a mixin called state machine because I'm importing this machine from the XState library, and this machine is responsible for transitioning all these different machine states, right? Which a lot of my components use because they need to be able to use this state machine mixin. They want to use some of these methods like what is the current state, what is the transition state, and then has these methods, right, to transition or fetch the current machine. So again, this XState example is just for an example. It's not related to Vue 3's composition API at all. It is just an example used for the purposes of converting my mixin, right? This is just an example mixin to convert. Reason for this is because I have a component here that uses the state machine as a mixin. It's a very simple component. So I thought it'd be better to show you guys the state machine because it's a relatively simple mixin. It only has 2 methods, a computed property and it has one property on the data method. So I think it should be easy to actually convert this into a composed component using the composition API. And I have a simple component here using this called password reset. So this is actually pretty easy to see what password reset does. It is just a password reset page. So this is the component. This is all the component is right here. It's just this reset password, right? And you've probably seen this in numerous websites, right? Where you have to log in and you have your old password, you have your new password, and you have a confirm new password, and then you reset it, and it sends you an email to reset your password. And that's all it does. So I would just want to give you this simple example here to convert, to show you guys how I did it. And maybe you guys will get some benefit out of that. Maybe you guys have similar mixins, and it should be easier for you guys to convert after this example here, right? So I'm just going to go line by line to show you guys how I exactly converted this mixin into this composable right here. So first of all, we got to actually install and use a composition API. So in our yarn file, or in our package.json file, right, we're going to install using yarn or npm, whatever you guys are using, to install vue-composition API. Right, this is going to be the library. So we're going to yarn add vue composition API. Okay. So after we use that, we can actually use the plugin, because like I said, Vue 3 isn't available yet, but the composition API is still available as a plugin on GitHub. So we can just install that. We have to use it now. So in our main app.js, where our entry point for our Vue app is, we're actually going to use it. So yeah. So here we're actually gonna plugins, right? So this is technically a plugin. So we're gonna put it here, composition API. So in your main.js file, you're gonna import Vue composition API and then do vue.use. And this is gonna be in your main file for your Vue entry point, where you have the init for your Vue component, right? This is the root Vue component. So we're going to do that, and then we're going to create our compose state machine. So then we're going to go back to here, and then in our where the mixin was, we're going to create a composables directory, right? So this is just something that Greg Pollack from Vue Mastery, he just recommended use a directory name like composables. You don't have to use that name. Could be any name that you want. I'm going to name it state machine.js. It's the same name because eventually I want this to supersede this mixins, right? I want this to be deprecated eventually, and we want the composables actually to replace it. And this component here, basically every component that was formerly using your mixin is going to be transitioned and refactored into a composable component. So how are we going to do that? Okay, so I'm going to walk you guys through it. So we're still going to import all the stuff that we used in our mixin, in this case from a third-party library like xstate, right? None of that changes. And this is the same structure and syntax as Vue 2, right? A Vue 2 component has all these properties, data computed. You might have a watcher as well. Methods, right? We don't have any watchers on here, but it's very similar to how you would do computed. Let's go through that later. So this is the component that's using my mixin. As I said before, password reset. It's very simple component. All you guys know what a password reset form does, and it uses my state machine to actually transition into different error states and password error states and stuff like that. So that's my use case for my xstate finite state machine right now. So you're gonna ask, like the main benefit of mixins, like I said, is to reuse your code across different components, right? You can do the exact same thing with a composable, except it's going to be a little bit more explicit because we want it to be more readable and maintainable. So the problem with the mixins was you didn't really know where all this code comes from, right? If you're just starting on a component, uses a whole bunch of mixins, it's really jumbled, right? It's a lot of jargon, a lot of spaghetti code. So the problem with the mixins is that it facilitates spaghetti code. We don't want that. We want it to be more structured. So composable is an idea of reusing your code across components without facilitating spaghetti code. Okay, so we're still going to have this export default function, right? We're going to change this to actually just, you can name it anything in your mixin, obviously depending on what your mixin is, right? So I'm going to say use state machine because the original mixin name is state machine, right? So previously we imported a mixin as import state machine from state machine, and then you put it in here as mixin state machine, right? So instead of state machine, we're just going to call it use state machine. Again, depending on your mixin name or what your mixin does, you can name it whatever you want, but in my example, I'm going to call it use state machine. So let's just say we pass in this one argument machine. So what is machine? Why do we need it? So if you look at the original mixin here, now this is just an example. So for your guys' mixins, it might be very different. But in my example, I have this .machine here, which is referencing something on this component that's been embedded into, right? That's using this mixin. So this .machine isn't actually defined anywhere in this mixin. It's defined by the component that's using this mixin, right? So you know how I said that because mixins are they can be very confusing because you never know, like in this example, you don't know what this is actually referring to. Where is this .machine coming from? It's not actually defined anywhere in this mixin component, right? So this .machine is actually set, and it's actually created by the component that's using the mixin. So that's another reason why we want the composition API to help us here to make it more explicit, so it's more readable, right? Because if I read this code, I'm going to ask, where's this .machine coming from? It's not defined anywhere in this component, right? That's very, very confusing. So one thing about the compose component we're going to do, we're going to define more clearly where these things are coming from, right? Another thing you guys should note is that this doesn't really exist in our composition API or compose component. So we're going to try to avoid using this because it doesn't really exist. So that's something that's very different about the Vue 3 composition API. So we're going to go through that as well. So we're going to pass in machine because we want this to be more explicit and defined. So what's going to happen now is that I'm going to refactor this component that's using the state machine mixin into a compose component, and I'm going to explicitly pass in the machine. I don't want this .machine to be defined here without any kind of reference to where it was created. That's very, very confusing, right? So we're going to explicitly pass it in here. So I'm going to import this because first of all, I have a computed property here. So I'm going to be using this computed wrapper from composition API, and any other variable that I'm defining here or in data. So anything that you have here in data that you're initializing should be using ref, or it could be using reactive, right? But we're not going to use reactive here since we're just defining one variable. So if I had a whole bunch of variables here, say I had like 10 things I was returning from data, I would use reactive, but I'm using ref here. But reactive and ref are very similar. They're basically just different ways of making your variables here reactive. So we can go through reactive later when I refactor this component. But first we're going to refactor the mixin. So ref and computed, I imported those because I need them both. Computed because I have a computed property, and ref because I have one variable defined in my data here. So you see this data, so anything in your data, in my case I'm only returning this one current machine state variable right here, is going to be using ref. That's why this one is using current machine state ref null. Alright, so let's go line by line and try to refactor this mixin into a compose component using the composition API. Okay, so I have this data here, and a lot of you may have data right in your components. So how do we refactor this into using the composition API? Well, let's just start by copying and pasting so I can show you guys a little bit easier how it's done. So this obviously doesn't work. So the new way of doing it now is we're going to do const current machine state, keep the variable name the same, and equals, we're going to transform this into a reactive object using the composition API. And this initial method, what we initialize this to is going to be what's passed in here. So for example, I could have like foo object here, and then I would do const foo equals ref and then initialize with object. Whatever you're initializing it with here, you just pass in here with ref to make it a reactive object. So that's basically how you do it. Anything in data, anything that you have here, you just use ref, right? And you pass in what you initialize it with. Okay, now we got to think about computed properties too. So I have a computed property here, and we got to figure out how to refactor it into a composed component, right? To be part of the composed component. So you can do a similar thing here, just copy and paste it. All right, so again, we imported this computed property wrapper from the composition API. So we're just going to make use of that and do const current state, which is the name of our computed property, and we're going to wrap it in this computed wrapper now, which takes in a function, and this is going to be the exact contents of our computed property. Just going to paste it in there. All right, and now we also got to change all the references of this, because this no longer exists in a composed component, right? So this dot machine, remember how I said that this is very confusing? We want to get rid of this dot machine. So we get rid of that because now machine is passed in to useStateMachine as an argument. So we no longer need to use this here. In this dot current machine state, well, we just define that up here. So this used to refer to the data property object, right? So we're just gonna get rid of this because now it's just in our function now. We don't need to worry about data or anything anymore. It's a reactive object now. All right, so pretty much the same code. All that we did was we just paste it inside this computed property wrapper now from the composition API, and we get rid of all instances of this, which is now more explicit as to where each of these values come from, right? All right, and that is how you would refactor a computed property. And by the way, guys, I don't have a watched property here, but if you have a watch here, which is kind of similar to computed, what you would do is instead of computed, or rather in addition to computed here, you can put watch here. And then you would do the same thing or similar thing to what we did here, right? Instead of computed, you would put this watch wrapper, and it also takes in a function, and it would be very similar to how we did the computed one. So that's if you have a watched property. All right, so computed, watched properties, and you have data properties kind of refactored all in here. Now, how do we do methods, right? So we got some methods here, very simple methods. We have a transition method. Actually, I don't think the second argument is even needed. Okay, we have a transition method and a fetch machine method right here. Okay, so what we do now is these methods just become functions now. So we have function, we paste that here, transition, right? And that's really it. That's the only thing you really need to do for your methods, is just to make them into functions and putting them inside your bigger function here that you're exporting. And of course, you got to get rid of this since we don't have that anymore. And this is actually, we probably had to change this into a let because we're reassigning it here. But yeah, that's all it takes really. There's nothing else really you need to do there. And fetch machine, the same thing. We're going to take this, and we're going to create a function for it, and that's really it. There's no this instance here, so we don't need to get rid of any of that. Now it's just going to say, oh, you haven't used it yet. Well, here's how the composed component works, and here's how we're going to make it more modular and useful. Is now we're just going to return and expose only the variables and logic that we need in our other components. So I'm just going to expose current state, transition, and fetch machine, right? And that's really it. We just refactored our state machine and mixin into a composed component using the composition API. Now this is really useful because say I didn't want to expose current state. I don't have to, right? I can just leave it out like this if I don't want to expose it. But since here I want to expose everything and make it public, then this is what I do. And then everything that uses this composed component now has access to these three: current state, transition, fetch machine, or whatever I exposed, right? They have access to that. Whereas in a mixin, you didn't have any control over that. It just exposes everything, right? So that's a big favor, huge win in favor of the composed component. All right, so now we've refactored our state machine mixin, right? And that's just an example of refactoring a mixin that, you know, doesn't have any template, obviously. All it is functions. It's just a bundle of code. And we're now going to refactor an actual component which has a template and everything. And it has to use this mixin now. So how do we get it to use this composed component now? Well, first of all, let's go over this component. Currently, it's using the mixin. I didn't get rid of it. I didn't deprecate it yet. It's still there. So we're just going to look at how it behaves now. We want to make sure that it behaves the exact same way, but with the composed component. All right, now remember that we had this computed property here called current state, right? That was on the old mixin and our new composed component. So right now I'm still using the old mixin right here. So we're just going to output the value of current state and see what it is. So okay, so right now the current state is idle, right? That's the initial state, and if we look at the code, nice states, okay, the initial state is idle. Now I expect it to actually go into this can submit state when I match the passwords up, because that's what is in the machine code. So you can see here on match, the password match, it goes into this can submit state. So once we confirm and we blur out of this field, got to make sure that matches, and then it's going to go into this can submit state, which is what the current state will output to. Now we can also turn it into this password error state. That's if it's mismatched. So let's say I have a different password here that's not matched, right? So previously I matched it. Now let's just put one digit less so that doesn't match. We're going to get this password error state right here. So there you can see basically the state machine working as expected here, right? Initially it's idle, then you can go into different states depending on what we did here, but that's the mixin working as intended, right? I just wanted to see what the current state is to make sure that we didn't change anything, that we didn't break anything when we refactored it to a composed component. All right, cool. So we're going to refactor this into a composed component now, right? So right now it's using the state machine mixin. This is the old mixin code. We're going to slowly start taking this out. So we're not going to use this mixin anymore, right? But we still want to share the code because our goal here is to be able to share code. We want to keep the advantages of the mixin, which is code reusability, but we want to do it in a way that makes it better than the mixin, that makes it more readable and maintainable, right? Okay, we're going to import use state machine from composables, because that's why I named my folder, right? I have my composables folder here, and it just made this new state machine.js in my composables folder. So yeah, now we can import the use state machine, right? Because I exported it here. I can import it from composable state machine. That's what that line does. And now we're also going to import reactive and 2refs. I'll explain what these do in a bit. So we're going to import it from the composition API plugin, just like how we did for ref and computed. We're going to import reactive and 2refs. Now the interesting thing here is with Vue 3 composition API, instead of having all this data, methods, computed, watched, props, we're going to have this huge setup method. So we're going to replace it all with this setup method right here. So I know that seems kind of weird to replace everything with a gigantic setup method, but it's actually going to make our code more modular, and it's going to make it more readable and maintainable as well. So instead of having props, data, methods, computed, and watch, we're going to pass everything into, we're actually going to have everything inside of setup. And setup takes in two optional arguments, which is props and context, which I'll go over later in a bit. So anything that was part of our props, like this admin ID, for example, we can now access with props.admin_id, right? So if you have even more props, you can just access them on the props object like that, right? So you remember how I said with reactive versus ref, they're pretty much the same thing. They're just different syntax. What you would use is you would use ref if you have a small number of variables that you're looking to transform into a reactive object. You would use reactive if you have like a large number, and I would say, but it kind of comes with a drawback as well, which is why I have this two refs here as well. And basically what that is when you use reactive, so here's what we're going to do. We have this data method right here, right, which we have on most of our Vue components. This is how we initialize our data objects, right, in Vue. So we're just going to do this. Everything that was instantiated before with data, this giant object here, we're going to use reactive for. And you can call this anything you want. I call it data because it makes it easier for me to think of this as the new way of doing data, basically. But you can do this and call it anything you want. I'm calling it data. And then you pass it reactive. And then basically everything that was previously inside your data, you just pass it to reactive here. And now you can access, these are all become reactive objects. And you can access them by calling data.password, data.errortext, data.machine, basically everything that was previously there. Again, this is just the name I used, but this could be anything like const foo, for example, and then you would access it with like foo.password because that's here, or machine or error text because that's all here, right? So that's just a way, reactive is basically just a way of making all these variables kind of reactive objects at once instead of using ref, right? So for me, it's a little bit easier to read here because, coming from Vue 2 and doing data this way, this makes more, is more of a direct translation to how you do it. But later on, you have to do two refs because there's a drawback to using reactive, which is that in the template, if you export this, you would have to use data dot every time, right? So we'll get to that later. Okay, so we don't need props anymore because all of our props is now accessed with props dot, right? So actually we need to add something here. We need to add this admin ID here, props.admin ID. So all of our props, we got to add a separate entry for it in reactive. It's part of our new object, reactive object. So anything that was in our props here, we got to add here, and then we just make the initial value the props value. So that's how I did that there. So you can take out the props because our props are now inside of our reactive objects, and then we don't need data anymore either because that's now all here. So we have methods now. So remember what we did with methods before, we make them functions, right? So we do the same thing here. Function, we just make these all functions. Function reset password, just copy and paste all that here. Right, they're just going to be functions that live inside of our setup method right here. By the way, this setup in the Vue lifecycle, it gets called after the before create, but before the create hook in Vue. So if you guys want to know, in the Vue lifecycle, the hooks, this gets called in the create section of the hooks, right? So this is like way before mounted. So if you were to do in Vue 3's composition API, you can also pass in hooks like mounted. You can do that here. You can do unmounted in here as well. Unmounted and updated and everything. The setup comes right in the create section of the Vue lifecycle, so like way before those, if you guys are wondering. That's why there's actually no create hook that's passed into setup, because it is part of the setup lifecycle. That's when it runs. So let's make the rest of these functions. Then we'll deal with this a little bit later. We're gonna make these functions inside the setup function and handle error as well. Okay. So of course, in your guys' Vue components that are using mixins, this is what you would do to kind of refactor it into a composed component. You do something similar, make all your methods functions, right? So we can get rid of all that. So the methods are gone now. Okay, so notice how I replaced everything. I replaced the data, the props, I replaced the methods. If I had computed and watch, they would also be replaced, and everything just goes inside this giant setup method right here that runs in the create lifecycle of Vue, right? So everything just gets put into this gigantic setup method, and what we got to do here in these functions is we got to replace this. So remember how I said this doesn't exist in the compose component. We no longer have access to it. So this .password is now data.password because password is now part of data now, right? It's right here. Password is now part of data now in this object, this reactive object. So we just replace it here, change everything from this to data. This .transition no longer exists. This is actually part of the mixin before, right? So this came as part of the mixin, but we now have a composable. So our composable returns current state transition fetch machine. So remember how I said that we can expose whatever methods that we want from this compose component, and we can actually use it in any component like this one that can use this composed function. So what we do here is we can just do const, and we take whatever functions and properties are exposed by our former mixin, right? We just converted it into a composed component. We just get it from there. So we use state machine, right? We imported use state machine because that was the exporter function here. Then we use that here. Do use state machine, and this takes in a machine, right? So where's our machine defined? It's actually defined here. This data.machine. So make sure that whatever context you're passing here, whatever object that you need, make sure that it can be passed in by the parent component, whatever's using this, right? So in this case, we pass in data.machine here. And that's where it comes from. That's where transition comes from. All right, so now we have all the methods, all the functions and properties from our composed state machine, right? So previously, we just imported this mixin to our component, and it just automatically had access to all of this, right? But you know, that's very magical, and it's not very explicit, and it's very confusing. So now we explicitly import all of these methods and properties from our composed state machine, our composed component that we just refactored from our mixin, right? So I think that makes a little bit more sense, and it's way more explicit, so it's more readable. It's easier to understand what's going on, right? So instead of this .transition, now we just use transition. Now it exists because we just imported it from use state machine. Our next function here, again, transition. This is interesting. Let's get back to that later, this .api. Data.password, right? We're gonna change that. So this .handle success is just going to change to handle success now, and this is just going to change to handle error because these were referencing functions on the same component, right? Handle success and handle error here, which are now actually part of the same closure. So we don't need to do that anymore. This is going to change to this data.password transition. This is a Vuex store. So for those of you who are familiar with Vuex, it's, you know, basically the Redux of Vue. I'm not going to go into it here, but I am going to say that for this .api and this .store, what you need to do is actually do context.root to access this. And it looks a little bit mysterious, but the second argument, I haven't talked about it too much. So I talked about props, right? This is the props that were previously defined and passed into this component. Context is actually what you would get from the Vue instance, right? What you previously accessed from this Now, remember how I said this doesn't actually exist anymore in this compose component, right? So whenever you have something like globally defined on this, on the view instance, like we have a $ API or on my app, right? Because I use this one to access all my API methods. This is some object I put on my in my app, right? That's global. Or you have a Vuex store, which is $store, right? It's you do you passed in store when you define your view instance, right? Here, previously, this was accessible using this .store when you used Vuex, right? And you do a dispatch right here to use it, right? And that's where your Vuex handler is. Well, now we don't have access to this, so we have to use context.root. And I know it seems a little bit strange, but that's basically how you're accessing what was previously globally defined on your view instance. You now access using context.root instead of this. So yeah, if you guys want to go more into that, you can read the view composition API docs. But just for the sake of keeping this video short, that's what I'm going to tell you for now. Yeah, so now we change this so it doesn't use any mentions of this anymore. No more instances of this. They've all been done away with, okay? So remember how I said one of the main advantages of using this compose component is that we can choose what to expose. It's more modular, it's more flexible, more maintainable, right? So we saw that here when we can return exactly the properties and methods that we needed, right? That were available to be accessed by other components. Well, in our component that's using this component, we can actually expose the same thing when we have a template, right? So now we have a template. Before, we just accessed everything on the component, right? So this password or this current state or this function, it had just access to everything. We couldn't really control what to expose to the template. Well, now we can with the Vue3 composition API, right? We just do a very similar thing, right, as part of the return of our setup method. So that's why everything is in this gigantic setup method. I know it seems a little bit weird that we do everything inside of this setup method, but now you can understand why, because we can control what to expose to our template here, which is a lot better in my opinion. So what we do here is now we need the two refs, right? So if we just did this ref, like if we just do something like const foo equals ref object, right? Of course, we import it here as well. Then we can just expose foo right here, and that's available to our template right away. But since we chose to use reactive here instead of ref, which like I said, it does the same thing, but it's a little bit different when it comes time to expose it. So you can't just do data here. You can't just do data. You got to do two refs, and you got to spread it as well. So you got to do this. Two refs data, and that will work. And the reason is because if you don't do that, you're going to have to do the data.password, data.password.old, data.password.new. Everything basically has to be prefixed with data, and that's really annoying. So that's why we should do two refs whenever we expose it to the template. Okay, so then we got to expose all of our other properties as well. So current state is going to be exposed, right? So right now it's going to run into a whole bunch of errors on our form right now, because it's going to say, oh, it's not defined on the instance, it can't find it. So we got to expose it, right? Current state, fetch machine, all our functions, validate passwords, reset password, handle success, handle error, I think. Actually, they're not used on the template, so it's okay, I won't expose them. So that's a good thing, I don't have to expose it if they're not used in the template. I only expose what I need. So that's all I need, I think. And let's see, what does our form say now? Okay, so cool. Now our form's working. So previously there was a whole bunch of errors saying that, couldn't access anything, but we have to expose it now from the setup method, which is a strength of the composition API. We can choose what to expose. And we have access to pretty much everything now. So now we should have everything that it needs. The vModel has all the functions that it needs. Validate password. It should all be exposed to the template now. So if I try to type in new password, confirm the password, and oh, look at this. It says cannot read property current machine state of undefined. I wonder why that is. Why is it looking for current machine state? Well, it's probably looking for current machine state because that's coming from our current state, which is a computed property on our state machine composable. So why is it saying it's undefined? Well, here's the thing. So this is another difference when we expose our variables to the template using the composition API, and that's we gotta use .value. So whenever we make something reactive, right, this actually becomes an object. Anything, even like a primitive, when it's wrapped in ref or reactive, it turns into a reactive object, and we actually can't just output it to the template like this, and we can't pass it to other functions like this if we want to actually access the value of it. So we gotta actually do .value. So here we gotta do .value, and we gotta do .value here. Whenever we're checking for the actual value of what we passed into the template, we gotta actually do .value here. So right now we looked at the current state. We gotta look at the current state .value. So let's look back here. All right. So it's still gonna probably error if I do this, and that's because it's trying to set the value, and we're not trying to. We didn't modify our code here to account for that. So everything here has to actually be based off of the value as well. So I'm going to take out this fluff code. This section isn't really needed. It's just kind of fluff code. And we're actually just going to return current state, current machine state here, .value. And here we're going to do .value when we transition as well. Here we're also going to put .value. And I think I forgot about this. Okay, we're going to get rid of that as well. All right, so let's look back on this form. All right, so now we should be able to see something here when I blur out of this form. Can't submit, okay, just as before, right? But notice how I don't see idle anymore. What happened to the initial idle state? Well, that's because now I'm outputting current state.value, so obviously this also has to be value, right? Because the way I created my object here, I didn't have that structure. So we gotta align the structures here. Okay, so now it has idle. Now if I put my new password, if it matches, then it should say can submit, just like before, which it does. And if it's not match, actually, that's a mismatch here. Let's see, I only put 3 characters here. It should be password error. Exactly what we expected, right? That's exactly what our old mixin did before. So we made sure that using our new composed component, it behaves the exact same way, which is exactly what we want, right? By the way, guys, I forgot to mention something, which is that when we're converting the props to using the reactive props, passing into the reactive wrapper here, remember how I was saying that you just access the props here, and that will be whatever props that were passed into this component. Well, I forgot to mention that this one has a default usually, and this particular one's default to null, but you might have a different default for, obviously different values like a Boolean or a number or something. So in this case, you do need to put a default here, otherwise it might error out when you're using this with, without a prop passed in. So in order to fully convert this, not only do you need to access this with props.admin ID, but you also need to do this here in case it's undefined, right? So now if it's undefined, you'll just go to the default value, whatever it is. In this case, it's null. So I just wanted to go over that since I forgot to mention it before. And you also saw the type on it, on the different props. You might put like type string, or you might put type number or Boolean. Now you don't need to do that anymore when Vue 3 comes out, because it has full TypeScript support. So you can just, this one would just be a string, right? Because TypeScript would enforce that. So that's a nice benefit as well. Don't need to worry about type checking, since TypeScript you can just annotate your types on it statically, and then TypeScript will do the type checking at compile time. So our goal here was to convert this component to using a composed component using the Vue Composition API to replace a mixin, but keeping the functionality the same, right? The main impetus is that we wanted to have a more cleaner, readable, maintainable code, which we now have, right? We see how everything here is clearly defined if you compare to the old one. Here's a better comparison with a diff, right? So here's what really happened. For this is our parent component, right? Previously, whatever values that we accessed, right, now we have to access it with the dot value, because the reactive object is wrapped in the reactive property, right? So we gotta, to actually get the value, we have to do a dot value, which is a little bit annoying, I know, but that's how we do it with the Composition API. And we're now going to import our state machine from the composables, right? Or whatever you refactored, right? You can call this whatever you want, import it from wherever you want, but now it's a function. And then we import reactives into refs. Again, this also depends. You can use ref here as well, depending on how many variables you need to refactor. No longer using a mixin, right? Props, data, methods, computed and watchers as well. Everything is now inside this gigantic setup method. We pass in the props and the context, which also contains the this instance of Vue, right? And we extract all of our functions and properties from our composed kind of mixin replacement here. This is our compose function that we're using, and this is method reuse, right? Code reuse right here is we just using, say I don't even want fetch machine, right? We don't have to use it, right? See, I'm not using fetch machine, then we don't import it and we don't expose it to the template. And it's as simple as that, really. You only get what you want, and this is really a huge improvement over mixins, because in mixins you just get everything whether you want it or not. Okay, and that's just really confusing. You end up having a whole bunch of bloated components because of that. And yeah, we have all our functions here, right? I don't even export these. I don't even expose these to the template because we don't even use them in the template. They're just for internal use on this component, right? So I don't have to expose it to the template. So before, the template had access to everything as well, and we didn't have any control over that. So there's huge advantages, in my opinion, using the Vue 3 Composition API. And yeah, guys, that's it. That's my example of converting a component. First of all, we converted a mixin to a composed component, which is a function. And we wanted to have an example of how do we get code reuse out of a composed component, right? And there's your example right here. We just refactored this component as well, which was previously using a mixin, getting the benefits out of the mixin, which was code reuse, but we're keeping it cleaner and, my opinion, much easier to read and maintainable. And refactor it into a composed component as well using the Composition API. And that's it, guys. It behaves the exact same way, right? Behaves the exact same way as before. We just tested that. And yeah, I think it's not too difficult. It just takes some time to really understand what your component is doing and what's the best way to refactor it. But if you follow what I wrote and what I just said, I don't think it should be too difficult. And I think in the future, Vue 3's Composition API would be very powerful as a way of making modular components. And I'm pretty excited to see what we can build with this in the future, right? So yeah, guys, that's it. That's my little Vue 3 Composition API tutorial, especially on converting a mixin and reusing that new component to get code reuse out of it, in the same way that a mixin would, right? But better, I think. So leave me any comments, suggestions, feedback, and as always, yeah, thanks for watching.